Good afternoon and welcome to this session on integrating Yammer with SharePoint on premises. My name is Michael Noel and I'm a partner at a company called Convergent Computing. I've been there for about 14 years now, doing a lot of consultancy work, essentially helping our clients to build and migrate to Microsoft solutions over those years. So traditionally that's been things like Active Directory, Exchange is something I got in very early on in my career, and then that led to SharePoint. I got involved with SharePoint back in 2001, or just prior to 2001 with the beta of Tahoe, the original version of SharePoint. And since then, I've been working with it ever since, helping our customers migrate to mostly on-premises versions. And then, of course, with the last couple of years, we've been heavily involved with helping them get to SharePoint Online and other cloud-based solutions. So the consultancy work is what drives a lot of the best practices that comes out of my sessions. In addition, I do a lot of books within the industry as well, mostly from Sam's Publishing. I got involved in the Unleashed series, which was actually the first SharePoint book series written. We came out with the original version. It came out 2 weeks before SharePoint 2003 came out. We've since updated that with every version. The latest version that's out is SharePoint 2013 Unleashed. At the same time, last thing I'll point out, I do a lot of travel around the world speaking on SharePoint primarily, a few other technologies as well. At this point, I've traveled to over 140 different countries and spoken in at least 70 of those countries. It's a passion of mine to travel. If you go to Joel Olson's session, you'll note I travel a lot with him as well too, so we hit a lot of the same places. But believe it or not, there's IT and SharePoint communities in almost every country around the world. A lot of them have the same desires, the same needs, the same requirements, because ultimately business is business, and IT serves those business requirements. Okay, so what we're going to be taking a look at in today's session is really a lot of the specifics around how to get an on-premises environment integrated together with Yammer. Now, there's a few areas in which some of what I'm going to be talking about also applies to a SharePoint Online environment, but primarily this is about existing clients who have SharePoint on-premises and need to get it integrated better with a Yammer environment. One of the confusing things that's out there is that if today you go do a search on the web for integrating Yammer with SharePoint, you get a lot of documentation, some of it directly from Microsoft, much of which is out of date at this point. Microsoft has continually changed their guidance on exactly what happens. They changed how Yammer directly integrates with Office 365 accounts, for example, and the way that it authenticates. So much of what is out there is essentially inaccurate. So it can be confusing trying to weed through that. In fact, to be completely honest with you, when I originally came up with the abstract for this session, I had a very different session in mind because there was a very different process involved in doing the integration. So that has since evolved over time. So definitely keep that in mind, but as we walk through this, that what I'm saying today may very well change in a couple months as well too, but this is accurate guidance as of today. And we're essentially going to focus on the three different areas in which you can do integration between Yammer and a SharePoint on-premises environment, and that includes the authentication area, that includes enterprise social integration, so embedding different Yammer groups within your SharePoint sites, et cetera. And then also automatic provisioning, so the ability to, when you create a user account within Active Directory, have that automatically provision a Yammer account as well, and then subsequently, if you disable that user account, have it disable their Yammer account as well. So there's a specific utility that was part of the acquisition, actually. It was originally built by the Yammer folks, but that's called DSync. So we'll be taking a look at that in my lab, going through a little demo on how that is actually set up and how you would actually do that. So essentially, as I just covered, there really are just three areas that we're going to be taking a look at. This first one is, which accounts are used to authenticate against Yammer. Because it's not necessarily as simple as it may sound. There are, of course, the default options when you get Yammer, but not everybody wants that. In fact, the majority of our clients generally want their internal AD accounts to automatically authenticate against Yammer itself. And that's, by the way, something separate than what the DSync tool does. The DSync tool just creates the account. It doesn't have anything to do with the authentication of the account. Authentication is handled by different mechanisms. So that's where some of the confusion is that people think if they just set up DSync that they're going to automatically be able to log in with username and password and have the credentials automatically sent across. And that's not the case. So then again, the enterprise social integration, we'll take a look at that as well as the provisioning piece. And then remember, do follow that Office 365 roadmap. If you haven't already been to it, it's roadmap.office.com. It will actually list out the upcoming changes that are happening to things like Yammer and anything within Office 365. And I keep mentioning Office 365 because ultimately Yammer is being consumed by Office 365. If you, for example, wanted to set up simply a Yammer subscription today, and that's all you wanted, and you wanted to pay the £2 per user per month solely for Yammer, you still need to create an Office 365 admin center and then administer your Yammer environment from that admin center. So it's becoming very tightly intertwined with it, whereas in the past, prior to the acquisition, then even in the months after the acquisition, you did everything through Yammer itself. That's no longer the case. Like I said, if you create a new account, it's tightly integrated. Okay, so we'll start with the concepts of the single sign-on. By default, if you do create that account, it's relatively straightforward to go in and say, create a Yammer account. And if you're not familiar with the process, it's actually, there's a free version of Yammer, which anybody can sign up to. So all you need is an email address at your work, and you can sign up and create a Yammer account for your business. In fact, some people that were not necessarily admins within their organization did that in the past. They would create different Yammer accounts and what have you. But that's the free version of Yammer. That's not really fundamentally what we're talking about because that doesn't have any integration components and it doesn't have all these different options like DSync and that type of thing. So when you go beyond the free version of Yammer, though, there's what's called Yammer Enterprise. Yammer Enterprise then allows you to do the automatically tie into whatever your Office 365 authentication framework is. And this is, again, one of the key changes is within the last couple of months, Microsoft changed it from the directory essentially being baked into Yammer to the directory being coming directly from the instance of Office 365. So it's tied into whatever your authentication framework is in Office 365. So that's why I say under that first bullet point, this is a new feature here. This is what's really fundamentally changed. Now it's changed for the better. Before you used to have to try to manage those different accounts. And you could do that with different third-party like Okta, or you could create a specific ADFS connector to make that kind of authentication happen. But fundamentally, it was a separate authentication framework. Now it's directly integrated. So if you already have Office 365, and if you don't already realize it, Office 365 includes Yammer Enterprise licenses. So you own Yammer Enterprise. So you can actually go ahead and provision Yammer Enterprise for your specific users and then have them authenticate using that particular framework there. At the same time, essentially most of our clients are going to then require that to use the DSync component and synchronize and actually use the authentication of their internal AD accounts as opposed to just using the AD accounts that are part of Office 365. That said, we do have some that don't use internal AD. We have a few new clients that really don't have their own AD at all. They just use cloud-based directory, such as Azure Active Directory, and they just remain within that space. But that's more of a niche field than anything else. Most organizations have an existing large AD implementation. They want to be able to use that for authentication. When it comes to SharePoint on-premises, there's a couple different options. One is you're defaulted to use the Azure AD accounts within Office 365. Again, you don't have an option to not use that. That's the new implementation. And at the same time, you can also use any SAML identity provider. They say either 1.2 or 1.1 or 2.0. They do recommend 2.0. So a SAML 2.0 identity provider, which would include third parties like Okta, but also include Microsoft's solutions like Active Directory Federation Services, which is a powerful and good tool, and we've set it up for a lot of clients. But honestly speaking, with the power of Azure AD, a lot of our clients are looking at that as opposed to necessarily deploying, especially if they don't already have an existing ADFS implementation. It complicates things, and you need a lot of servers to set up a highly available ADFS environment. So organizations are instead looking at features like Azure Active Directory. So fundamentally speaking, if you want to go beyond the default mechanism, which is just to use the Azure AD instance that's provided for you as part of your Yammer subscription, you need to use what's called the Azure Active Directory Sync tool. And so the Azure Active Directory Sync tool, there's a few specific, essentially, deployment steps that you have to go through to actually get this set up. And essentially it comes down to going through the prerequisite lists up in Microsoft. There's some specific things about the size of servers, depending on how many users are within your Active Directory. Ultimately speaking, it's generally just a virtual server that's set up, that's purpose-built for the Azure AD Sync tool. With enough memory to support a decent number of users. So again, check Microsoft's prerequisites on that. You have to add in your company domains directly into the Office 365 Admin Center. Again, everything's going through Office 365 Admin, so you're not doing this through the Yammer tool itself. So you verify and add your internal domains to them so that they're listed within Office 365, and then you go through and activate the AD synchronization directly from the Azure AD Sync tool itself. That process itself is relatively straightforward. It connects up, it allows you to go through, take the tool, connect up to the Azure AD instance that sits up there, and then start to synchronize information. You need, of course, proper security credentials for accounts that would have the rights to be able to read those things and potentially make changes as well. There's what's called the ID Fix DSync error remediation tool that's also used to kind of clean things up after that. And then you go through and configure, set up the actual tool itself, download the 64-bit version, and configure it to synchronize directly with Office 365. After that, verifying is the next step. You verify directory synchronization, and then activate whatever synchronized users you want to be able to activate. So you can go through and break it down and say only specific users in particular are used, et cetera, et cetera. And that creates that. Obviously, this is a whole session in of itself to actually go through the entire process to do that. And there are Azure AD. This is the same concept of any other Azure AD synchronization. So going through that process, again, is essentially the steps that you would go through to be able to then sync your internal AD environment with the Azure AD that's part of that Yammer subscription. Okay, the next major area that we're going to take a look at is how you integrate the existing SharePoint sites with the enterprise social features. And this is what has fundamentally changed as well. Because before this used to be a roughly 30-page Microsoft Word document on how to get it set up that was provided by Yammer. And it went through a process where you went through and downloaded an app from the SharePoint App Store, et cetera. That has fundamentally changed as well. They've actually simplified the process quite a bit. But essentially, if you are using the Yammer app today, in roughly 1 month, it will no longer work again. In fact, I think it's less than a month at this point. It's somewhere in May. The app is just going to disappear from the App Store, and it's not going to work anymore. So if you went through that process to set up the Yammer apps within the SharePoint App Store so that you could go through in your SharePoint on-premises environment and add different Yammer snap-ins and pop different groups in there, that goes away and that has to be replaced. So definitely take a look at what you need to do to replace that. If you are using SharePoint 2010 and you're using the web parts that were provided as part of that, they've indicated that those are going to go away as well too, or those are going to stop working as of 2016. And they're essentially going to change to using what they call Yammer Embed, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying you can take some embedded links, put some embedded code that comes directly out of Yammer, and take that code and put it directly into a web part in SharePoint so that that web part just goes out and pulls that Yammer information and then displays it within the site itself. So it's a replacement for the Yammer app. It's a simplification of that process, and it's essentially turned on almost by default, although there is one change that you have to make in there to essentially enable those features. And I'll show you that here in a second here. By the way, so this is This is how you would do it if you're using Office 365, which I just threw up there just in case there are people using SharePoint Online. There's a specific command that is not on by default. By default, you're using the SharePoint social features within your SharePoint farm. So in Office 365, you make that change within, let's say, 5 minutes or so. It switches everything over to using Yammer as opposed to using the SharePoint newsfeed. And then if you are using SharePoint on premises, it's a similar location, but it's within SharePoint Central Admin. You go in and configure the Yammer integration piece. You'll actually see a link here called Office 365 that was added in later updates of SharePoint. Within Office 365, then you can go in and specifically activate Yammer. So if I take a look, for example, within the lab where I'll be doing the DSync tool here later, I can show you this. Let's see where it is. Yeah, essentially this is where it is within SharePoint Central Admin. Again, it doesn't take too long to activate this as well too. Once it's activated, that it allows for the Yammer to become active within the site itself. Okay, so again, the process itself relatively straightforward. You go into your Yammer site. You pick whatever particular group you want to be able to embed into your SharePoint location, and then you essentially just click a link that says get an embed feed. So let me see if I can do this within a, let's see, where's my Yammer site here. So if I take a look here, and within a particular group, so if I go into my groups, oops, embed this group, this is the text that I need. All I'm really doing is taking that, putting it into a script editor web part within SharePoint site, and then it allows the group to be displayed within the site. So a little bit simpler, a little more esoteric than a simple app itself, but that's how they decided to change that. So you put it in, grab the code, and then create that script editor web part, which if you haven't done that before, that's just under media and content when you're adding in a web part within SharePoint, and then it allows that group to be directly added into that site. Okay, the directory sync tool is, well, probably one of the more interesting tools that's provided as part of this. Again, this is the tool that allows you to automatically provision and deprovision the accounts within Yammer. Deprovisioning oftentimes gets forgotten about when you're going through an automatic provisioning process, but of course it is equally as important, and I would probably argue it's even more important to make sure that people don't have access after their accounts have been disabled. So you want to be able to know that once you've disabled their AD user account, they no longer have access to cloud-based services, and that's really what this is providing them the capability to, is going through and disabling that as well as being able to create those. But so what it is it's essentially a synchronization tool. Again, automates the provisioning and the deactivation of those different accounts. It runs very simply. It actually does simple LDAP calls to your domain controllers. In fact, you don't even need to have a domain join system to get this to work properly, which is one of the interesting things about the new Microsoft, I guess you could say, is that in the past, if you wanted to do anything, it had to be domain join systems. There was pretty siloed in exactly how things were done. There were a lot of very custom ports that you would have to open up. The firewall guys would be pulling their hair out. This is not the case. You can set up a private machine to do this. In fact, I did this very quickly. I just provisioned a Windows 2012 R2 machine, installed the utility on it, no SQL Server, nothing like that. Utility installs very quickly, and then goes through and just creates LDAP calls to Active Directory, put in a service account, and again, I'll show you that process. But it's pretty simple and straightforward, and allows you to then pull the information about which users are needed to then synchronize up against Yammer itself. So what it essentially does is that it makes it easier to manage the user account information through the automation process itself. So you don't have to bulk add users to Yammer, which would be the traditional way of doing things, or just go through and add users one at a time, which obviously in large organizations this can prove to be a bit of a challenge itself. And then again, it will automatically remove them out of the Yammer network once that user account is disabled. The process itself I'll briefly walk you through this, and then I'll show it to you within the DSync tool. But essentially, it's a process of creating a service account, filling out a template, installing the tool, and then configuring it. And we'll kind of walk through what that looks like here. But you do need a service account. That needs to be a service account that's active within Yammer itself. It needs to be an Yammer verified admin. So if you haven't gone through the process of creating a verified admin or seeing what that looks like, it's a good idea to create a dedicated service account for that. In my case, I'm actually just using one of the accounts that I provisioned as part of this, but it's my account that's a verified admin. But yeah, you would go through and create a new mailbox for that user, go through the sign-up process, get your activation link, and then go through the standard sign-up flow to create that account. Obviously needs an email account to be able to activate the Yammer account so that it can start to run the service. If you are using SSO-enabled networks, so if you've configured the SSO that we talked about earlier, the Yammer SSO, the particular steps are listed here. You're basically going through and adding in a specific desktop app that would allow you to then integrate together with that SSO-enabled network. And then Microsoft does provide for a checklist that would go through and allow you to prepare for that. So it is recommended. Microsoft says, go through, make sure you've got the proper credentials set up, make sure you have the proper business rules, make sure you have the SMTP server, et cetera. Again, it's fairly straightforward, but it's useful to walk through that checklist. And then the installation process is, we'll walk through each one of these step by step, essentially installing the files, changing some network settings, connecting it to Yammer, connecting it to AD, and then enabling synchronization. And then, again, as part of that process, this is really not complex. You just go through, install it on the server, doesn't need much space, choose an installation location. The download itself is actually not very big as well, too. It's only a few megs in size. And then at that point, it'll just walk you through this kind of wizard. Now the wizard itself is a little bit esoteric and it doesn't allow you to skip around, so you have to move step by step. You can't just go, you can't go forward and test things out. So if one thing is not working, you're not going to be able to go through the validation steps or the sync steps, for example, and see what happens. But you do need, again, the information from Yammer itself to be able to then go in and add those fields directly to it. So the next step is to configure it to talk to AD. So we're going to point to a Active Directory domain controller or a alias that's associated with multiple domain controllers. And then we go through and specify the different accounts that we authenticate as, just to be able to pull through. And this actually doesn't have to be an account with any type of special rights other than read. It just needs to be able to read users' email and other fields that are going to be synced directly to it. So I don't necessarily recommend you do something like put a domain admin in there. It's not necessary because it's not writing changes from Yammer back into AD. This is a one-way push of information from AD up into Yammer. At this point, you actually need, it's a requirement, believe it or not, to put in an SMTP server to send the reports to. If you don't do this, you can't actually press the Start Sync button. So if you're trying to test that, you need to run it off of some kind of SMTP server. You can just use Microsoft's SMTP servers up on Outlook.com, for example, if you have an account up there, so that you can just send it using whatever your Hotmail credentials are, or something like that, or whatever SMTP server you have access to, or of course an internal SMTP server would be better from a high availability perspective. But it'll go through then at that point and start to query Active Directory on a regular basis to synchronize. So let's actually take a look at this real quick here and kind of see a little bit more detail about what I'm talking about. I created a specific machine just to handle this, and I enabled sync just to test it out earlier, but I went through and disabled it again. But I'll walk through the settings that are part of this. I'm connected directly up to a Yammer Enterprise subscription that I created for this, and I added the credentials for that. So Again, that was really just adding in, whatever username you're known as, your password, and it'll test it. Once it's tested, you could either log out or then log back in. So the Yammer settings, not very complex. The domain controllers, this is my domain controller that I have internally here. I'm authenticating as an account on that particular machine. This is my personal account. Normally, again, I would use some kind of a service account that just has read rights to be able to see all of the user accounts that are within that domain. And this can be a completely different domain. In this case, it is. This is kind of an internal domain that I use within my Hyper-V environment at home. As long as it really ties the user together with the Yammer user based on the email address field. So if your email address field, in my case, I've gotten a user account with an email address field of Michael@sharingtheglobe.com, which is the Yammer email address. That's how it ties that user account together. So it actually has nothing to do with really what domain they're using internally. All right, so then it'll validate, and there's actually you can export out to an XLS file if you want to go through and be able to use Excel to kind of narrow it down and see which kind of users it pulled as part of this. And in a second here, I'll walk you through what it looks like to actually put some different filters in place. But then we go through and actually start the sync. So at this point, you've run through the wizard, everything tested out properly. I entered in the SMTP address, and it will start to sync. Now, it's a little bit frustrating because it's not really obvious what's happening from here. You actually need to go in and open up the little Yammer about down here, go to Advanced Configuration, which pulls you into the program data folder that has a couple different log files in it, and then you can take a look at the log files and see exactly what's going on. So in this point, you can see I started sync. It's going to start to see what's out there. If there's any new users, it'll add them into it. You can see earlier on I added in a user today, etc. And actually, I can go through and add a user just to see what that looks like. Let's create a new user here. And like I said earlier, I don't know if you caught it, but if this user does not have an email address listed in the email address field, it will not actually add it unless you add a specific filter to bypass that. So in this case, I'm going to put in. And it has to be one that's associated with your Yammer subscription as well, too. So I don't have Exchange within this environment, so I'm just adding in the email address field. I'm not actually creating a mailbox. But in most organizations, it would be a mailbox that you have that's then associated with that they can get Yammer subscription information on directly from. And they can also go through that setup process, because just provisioning the user doesn't complete the setup process. You actually have to walk through the email that gets sent to the user as part of that initial provisioning. So by doing that, another frustrating thing is this only kicks off once an hour. So for me to be able to actually see that new user account that's created, I have to actually go through and disable the sync and then enable it again, which will force it then to run all over again, as opposed to having to wait. And by the way, it takes at least 20, 30 minutes, which is probably why they have this, do it every 60 minutes, for the Yammer Enterprise to push down the information that says that everything's completed properly. So don't expect that to happen very quickly. It takes some time before you'll actually see that. Okay. It's waiting. It's still doing it. Yeah, unfortunately, it's still waiting for it. I kicked off that previous sync job, so that's going to take a little bit longer for that. But eventually, once that comes up, then you'll see it'll add a particular user directly into it. These particular files here are the ones that you can modify. You can open up to actually change some of the parameters and modify specific settings, such as different email addresses, if you wanted to specify which email addresses are part of it, if you wanted to specify different OUs, and I'll show you, I've got some slides on those. But it's essentially just opening up, modifying these files, restarting it, or on the next sync, after it restarts, it will then pick that up. But before you finalize the sync, that's why you want to go through and take that Excel spreadsheet and make sure that it has only the users that you want to sync. Because especially if you're paying for Yammer licenses and you sync up every service account that you have within your organization, you're going to be paying a lot of extra money for things that you didn't necessarily need to be able to use. Okay. Let me walk through some of those customizations here. In terms of custom queries then, one of the most common ones is you want to limit the users that are pulled by the directory sync tool to only those that are part of a specific email domain. So if you are using a specific email domain specifically for Yammer, you put that in there and it'll only put those particular users up there. Now, if you didn't have that in place and you had users with other domains, you'll just get a whole bunch of errors that show up. I've tried it out. It actually shows the errors directly in the tool, and it'll just say that's not a email address that's associated with your Yammer subscription. Therefore, we're not going to go ahead and provision it. But what's also another common thing to do is people will go through and specifically filter out users based on other types of categories. So they want to make sure it's a user account, or they want to make sure it matches a specific custom attribute. So you can essentially do LDAP queries directly in those files to be able to update and change what is syncing back. Filtering by OU, this is also another fairly common one that you want to do. So you actually take the GUID of the particular ID and then go through and specify which OU you want to be able to sync users from. You can add multiple OUs if you had a broken out organization structure, or if you had one where all of the user accounts were in, you can just make it granular and only pick particular OUs that it's going to sync back up. Okay. Let me show this one here too. As I mentioned, the log files, those are the ones that are stored, the service.log and the UI.log will show you different log information about what's going on. It's your first point of, and pretty much the only point of troubleshooting. There's a location up within the Yammer site as well too that will show you whether or not there's any type of configuration conflicts. In my simple environment, I don't necessarily have any configuration conflicts in it, but if I take a look, let's see, this is the one here. If I take a look, directory integration, this is, by the way, it'll take, again, about 20-30 minutes for this to show up, but once you enable directory sync, your sync status will show up as being enabled here, and if there was any type of conflict or any type of problem where it couldn't match up a user account, where the DSync tool sent it up to Yammer, but Yammer couldn't create the account or couldn't match up the account, you'll see something that's specified in here. And you can also go through and customize what the email invitation that goes out to people when they do get new accounts that are created. You can customize the welcome message or the email invitation. Obviously, that depends on what your corporate policies are. But you do have to be a network admin, or actually in this case, a verified admin within Yammer to be able to go through and turn on that directory integration, or you won't even get past the point in the DSync tool where you create that. I haven't found much use for the UI log. Potentially, if you're trying to troubleshoot some other issues, you could go into some specifics on exactly what it's doing, exactly what kind of fields it's pulling across, etc. But for the most part, most of the troubleshooting that I've been able to do is within the service log, which pretty much walks you through exactly what's happening. So let's see if it's actually gotten anything. Yeah, it's still waiting for the last sync to finish before it'll even run another sync. But a fairly straightforward tool, again, not too much in configuration as far as it's concerned. But it is a tool that is highly useful, especially in larger organizations, so you don't have to, again, do mass changes with users or do some type of mass bulk export or that type of thing. Does anyone have any specific questions?